here. I hate lectures. I hate when somebody stands up and really does a PowerPoint. So obviously we'll leave time at the end for questions, but please interrupt while I'm talking. If I say something and you either want to know, whoa, why was that, or you have a question, or especially if you disagree, I'm going to tell you a lot of the slideshow is going to be about Montreal and art history, so a lot of you that lived it, but I don't think anybody here knew Lincoln, but you lived part of it. So please interrupt and let's have a fun time reliving some of our history. My book is called The North Star, Canada and the Civil War Plots Against Lincoln. I'm going to take you through some of the main themes that I explore. I was a history student. We were talking. We were both graduated from Northmount High School. Maybe anybody else in Northmount here? Wow. Live Northmount. I went to McGill in 1970, and that was a pretty stormy time, if you remember the early 70s. Especially if, like me, you look like a young Che Guevara. I worked on the McGill Daily. Remember, 1970 was the October crisis.
Yeah.
I'd walk home at 3 a.m. in the morning because I was working on the McGill Daily, looking like that, with machine gun-toting soldiers.
Yeah.
Forced to give my ID to explain why I was walking home at 3 a.m. And it was, the Vietnam War. They were stormy times at McGill. I loved it. I studied history because I knew I wanted to be a journalist since I was in high school. In fact, the first interview I ever did in high school by letter was with a young prime minister called Pierre Elliott Trudeau. I knew I wanted to be a journalist, but I knew I had to study history to understand where the country had been. And one day at McGill, I walked down, I left the rotted gates, walked down a few blocks to, I think it was called Morgan's back then, but the Bay, as we know it. And on the corner of Union and St. Catherine, some of you may have remembered, there was this plaque. And the plaque was to Jefferson Davis, the leader of the Slave South. And I remember thinking, why is there a plaque in my city for Jefferson Davis, the leader of the Slave South? And why is it still here at the time? That would have been about 100 years after the Civil War. Well, I didn't get that answer until I had written 7 other books. I've written books on the Ku Klux Klan, the Hells Angels, the Stephen Truscott case, some of you may remember, child abuse. I did many documentaries. But I finally got around last year to investigating that plaque and published The North Star. Now, most of you, I think like me, if you thought about the American Civil War in Canada, you would think the Underground Railroad, right? Canada was the last terminus. About 30,000 escaped people who were slaves. You literally, if you just crossed the line into Canada, you were free. You were part of the British Empire. We abolished slavery in 1834. So the Underground Railroad is the only thing we were on the good side. We were the angels. Martin Luther King, when he came to Canada, sadly a year before he was assassinated, talked about Canada being the North Star. Canada was called the North Star because if you were trying to escape from Alabama or Mississippi, you just looked for the North Star and just kept going until you hit Canada. So that was my view of Canada at the time. Let's travel back, right? Montreal, the 1860s, the Royal Montreal Curling Club, I believe, was on Drummond. If you were curling in Drummond, you'd be walking down through the main streets. Montreal was a bustling town, about 100,000 people, biggest town in what was called British North America. This was the political map of Canada, of the U.S. and Canada at the time. And instead of Quebec, we were called the British North American provinces. We were still a few years away from Confederation. Canada East was what we now call Quebec. Canada West was Ontario. The other provinces weren't part of that connection, Nova Scotia. And the U.S. was also divided, right? You had Lincoln's North, and then many states in the South that had broken away and then set up the slave confederacy. So that's what Canada looked like politically in 1861 when the war started. Now, when the war started, Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, and most people in the North hoped or assumed that Britain, and therefore Canada, would side with them. This was a democratically elected government. It had this kind of illegal secessionist slave South. But in fact, Canada, like the rest of the British Empire, declared neutrality. And if you think about it, neutrality kind of meant, you know, between democracy and slavery, we're not going to pick sides. Kind of like Putin invades Ukraine, well, we're going to be neutral, right? That was the effect. But what it meant is that neutrality meant that slave Confederates could come to Canada and quite openly, not like Russian spies in the 50s or, you know, people who were quite openly advocate, live here, and be supported because Canada was neutral. It was totally legal. And that's what happened. Canada became a haven for the Confederates. It's early 1864. It's the third year of the war. Like most wars, everybody here remember, you know, World War II, almost most wars, the bad guys, if you want, or the, you know, women start winning at the beginning in World War II, right? Hitler was winning 39, 40, 41. It's only around 42 the tide begins to turn. Same thing in the Civil War. The South was winning in the first 2 years. By early 1864, the South isn't losing, but they're beginning to stop winning. It's getting bad. Their cities are being attacked, burned, razed. And Jefferson Davis is quite desperate. And so in a secret meeting of his parliament, he gets $1 million to be set aside for secret services. And they'll be led by Judah Benjamin, the Secretary of State, interestingly enough, the only Jew in the Confederacy, and quite a powerful man. He will lead the Secret Service, and most of that $1 million, it's $1 million back then, today that's like $12 million. Most of that money will go to Canada. Davis will name Jacob Thompson, who was a Washington